Hey, everybody, it's George the Tech. We're continuing our series in 2025 with our first appearance for the year. This is the Partner Profile series, and these are all folks who we love to work with, who we believe in as creators of product, and who are just awesome people. And one of them is here with us today. His name's Derek. He's the CEO and founder of Vanguard Audio Labs.
George the Tech.
How you doing today, Derek?
I'm doing good. It's a balmy 40 degrees here in Pennsylvania, so it's nice and toasty today by the metric of this winter. So
you started and you formed your years in producing audio gear in California. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
How many years did you live and work in California?
So I was born in California, Southern California, born and raised in the San Gabriel Valley. And I lived there for 33 years, up until about 3.5 years ago, I think, is when we moved out here. And I'd been truly working in audio for, I guess, trying to think out loud here, almost 15 years before I came out here.
Yeah. So our histories in working in pro audio are pretty similar in timeline, I would say, because I graduated college in 97, moved to LA in 2004. So I've been working in LA in audio for 21 years. So we've both been at it quite a while. Where did you form your background in pro audio? Did it start in music like so many of us did?
Yes. It was this weird, like, I was a tinkerer kid. It drove my parents crazy. I would take stuff apart without asking.
Yes. But did you put them back together? That's the question.
Sometimes, part of learning how to put things back together is failing at first, The success is just iterative failure, So
that sounds familiar. Yeah.
I was a tinkerer, and then in junior high I started getting into music, band with the friends, all that, and instead of like woodshedding and being good at my instrument, I was like, well, my guitar buddies have these pedals that do cool things, so I want my bass to sound like that. And there was a dearth of bass pedals back when I was playing, so I was modifying guitar pedals for bass frequencies and stuff like that, and that kind of like naturally progressed into my days when I went to school for music, and quickly realized, like, everybody else is so much better at the making of the music. And I got into engineering, and I was still tinkering, and I was still fixing my friend's gear all the time, and then started fixing my professor's gear. And that kind of morphed into working at an audio company for my internship, a microphone company, and they hired me full time after my internship was over, and away we went. And I just kind of fell backwards into it, and I've been here ever since. But I love it. I love this marriage of the technical and the objective. Noise floors and signal to noise, and total harmonic distortion, and all these things, right? And then the subjective, which is like, why do we like the way things sound? What part of it is tickling our brains, even though objectively it may not be as perfect as, say a tube is not nearly as perfect as a transistor from objective perspectives, but we like the way tube mics sound. So it's that weird marriage of the two, which means you can never, be, quote, the best or have the best mic at anything. And it's just this constant pursuit of trying to make tools that help people make music, or in your case, voiceover.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is just a very constrained form of music. Is voiceover.
I suppose so. There's definitely some musicality and cadence in the audiobooks I listen to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, our backgrounds are similar. I'm sure a lot of us that have an interest in pro audio have a similar background that way. I also had music, and I realized that performing it was not my strong suit. Certainly woodshedding, as you so aptly put, was definitely not my strong suit. And so I was also pursuing engineering. I thought I wanted to do electrical engineering. I thought I wanted to design equipment, but I didn't realize that it was out of my purview. And what I really wanted to be doing was a more creative side of engineering. So we just kind of shunted off in different directions, but with a very dissimilar background, which is really cool. So after some time interning and then getting hired with a microphone company, how long did it take before you realized, geez, I could be doing my own brand? When did that come about?
Without going into too much detail, the company I was working for, the defecation hit the oscillation there, and I was out of a job and worked kind of odd jobs for a little bit within music. And eventually the guy who had started that company approached me about partnering with it, and his name was Ken Avant, and he said, I'd rather keep doing this, and I'd rather have you on board because you are one of the better parts of that company, and how can we use this as kind of a vehicle to bring my ideas to market. And at that point, I'd already been helping some on the design side. And then I just sort of became fully engrossed in it when we started Vanguard. So, yeah, just kind of learning as I go. I learn something new every time I design a mic. I learn something new every time I
Yeah.
repair a mic for the most part, you know?
I was familiar with Avantone. In
Yeah.
fact, I used to do sales for a small boutique pro audio dealer in Culver City. I remember that was my introduction to Avantone. That was my introduction to going to NAMM show, for that matter, actually. And so, shadowing those guys at NAMM and walking the halls, which is when I got to meet you the first time. You know, I was so annoyed at those times because the guy I was walking around and shadowing knew everybody. So it took for freaking ever to get anywhere in the halls, right? And flash forward 15, 18, 20 years now, I'm finding myself more and more in that kind of situation where I go from booth to booth and I've gotten to know so many other amazing manufacturers and fabricators. So I know what
Yeah.
that feels like now.
I feel the same way about NAMM. The difference is I at least just get to sit in a booth and have them all come to me, which has its pros and cons. Don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
NAMM is
Mhm.
crazy. How long did it take you to recover from NAMM this year?
Not long because I only went 1 day and I had
Okay.
fully intended to go 2 days, and due to different circumstances and just realizing I needed a day, I had just been traveling for 10 days leading up to NAMM. So I'd been out of town, I'd been in another conference the week before, and so trying to squeeze 2 days of NAMM in on top of all of that,
Yeah.
it was not in the cards for my mental health. So I did 1 solid full day. I never left North Hall lower level. I'm serious. I never left that hall. Like normally I wanna go see hall A and I wanna go see hall E and see the basement. None of that. I just
Yeah.
focused. I was like, "Okay, I'm gonna focus. I'm gonna just mow the lawn," as I like to say, up and down and see vendors, new things, and friends, and that's what is hard about it covering the event, is I
Yeah.
wanna chat with my friends that I've gotten to know at NAMM. Like, I don't know if you've ever gotten to chat with, Jonathan Little of Little Labs.
I have not.
Coolest freaking guy.
I unfortunately at NAMM, I get out of my booth occasionally, mostly during the morning. Oh, I go and hang out with my manufacturer friends as much as I can. And then just, the NAMM's such a slog. And it's so hard to get out of the booth when you're I don't know if you've ever done any exhibiting, but um,
I have in the past at some smaller shows, you know? The first time I did it was in 2008, and I was there solo, and I was a voiceover conference, and people came up to me nonstop for 3 or 4 days wanting to talk
mhm,
to me. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I can't
yeah,
even come up for air." It was intense. So, I've had a taste of it. That's for
yeah.
sure. So, microphones, we all love microphones. We're obsessed with microphones. So, how do you find that you fit your microphones into the market when you know there's just so many other microphones? What do you see that Vanguard microphones is doing that's a little bit different, and what makes it stand out and why people keep buying them?
There's a lot of microphones to choose from. And a lot of people go, oh, why is there that many microphones? And they all ultimately do the same thing, which is take the airwaves and turn it into electrical signal. And, then that gets converted into bits and goes into your computer and yada, yada. Right. But, how they do it is different. Like, right. Like no microphone hears the way our ears do. The closest they got is with, I don't know if you've ever seen the Fritz microphones, the Neumann ones that look like the head.
Oh, Fritz, yeah, the head
Fritz.
mic. They
Yeah.
yeah, mhm.
So certainly there's a lot of microphones out there. I get that. I will say that what we try and do is originality. We don't try and sound like anything else. We're not looking back 75 years to try and pretend to be an older design from a more famous company that's $50 cheaper than the last guy that did it. So I have always thought of microphones like paintbrushes, right? Like ultimately, I just make a tool
Mhm.
and the artists make the music. So whenever I'm making a tool, I go, how is it that I can make a tool that makes people's jobs easier, that gives them more creative options, um, and that is reliable and functional and most of all, acoustically and orally pleasing. So orally with the AU, obviously.
Mhm.
Although I suppose for voiceover, it's orally with the OR as well.
That's true.
But yeah, so when I approach it from that perspective, it makes it much easier to get more creative. So, like for instance, our shock mounts, right? Like we were the first people that did like they call it, some brands call it like a cutaway shock mount or whatever. But really, ultimately, it's just spider shock mounts are dumb. The typical shock mounts you see with the four legs and the hair scrunchie, like that stuff is the stuff that holds up your underwear. It's elastic, right? We know how long that lasts. And I think it's ridiculous that if one of those bands breaks, your microphone, whether it be $100 or $5,000, hits the floor. So we
Oh,
did the
dude, I
cutaway.
can't tell you how many times I've seen so many videos of actors in front of another big German brand microphone dangling perilously from the elastics that
Yes.
are years stretched out. It's
Yeah.
the most stupid thing. And then you have this giant shock mount that takes up so much space,
Mhm.
and it just makes the mic like foreboding to get even close
You
to, you
can't
know what I
close
mean?
work the mic if you need to, and for like vocalists in the studio, that's super important. I suspect for voiceover guys to be able to change proximity effect and things like that.
Very much so.
Um, and so I've had takes as an engineer ruined by, the chin of a performer bumping up against the mic. And then like, in the studio, close miking a guitar cab or something like that. You can't do that with a traditional shock mount. So I was like, these are dumb. Let's just completely rethink the shock mount. And I know it's good because about 5 or 6 other brands have started copying it. And I'm like, okay, so we did something right. And we don't even use, we don't use that elastic. We use 6 jet engine O-rings, actually. The guy that
Mhm.
supplies them to me is down in Southern California. He also supplies them to Boeing and JPL and guys like that. So it's an actual jet engine O-ring that we also have them add a UV resistant additive to. Like I've had my personal V13s for almost 10 years now, and I have yet to change an elastic band on them. And they're just as rock solid as they were when I put them together.
That's awesome,
So
awesome. Now V13 is the tube mic, I know that.
that is correct.
Was that your flagship or at least your launch mic? Was that the first thing you worked on for
That
Vanguard?
was the first thing we worked on, yeah. And since then, I know the one that you like is the V4, which is our FET mic, which I know setting up a tube power supply and stuff for VO can be a little bit,
It's a little
spooky.
it's daunting for people who are going, "Wait, I need a mic cable and another thing?"
Yeah.
Like a mic, I mean, these are the people that are like, "Mic interface? What's a USB so it's like, yeah, it's a little bit, but I do have folks that have used it, and I think the first time I found out about who you were may not have been actually at NAMM, but it might actually have been through one of my clients, Scott Rummel.
I was going to say, was it Scott? Because he's the one who kind of
I
like
think so.
accidentally got me into VO. Yeah.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about how you got to know Scott.
Well, funnily enough, that was through NAMM. Our very first NAMM, he wandered by our booth. We started talking. He was mentioning he was looking for other mics because he was on, the 416,
Yep,
which, I mean, most of your clients know the story of that mic and the legend of
yep.
how it came to be with, what was it, Ernie Anderson? Am I correct on that?
Yeah, he pretty well is the one credited for that microphone
Yeah.
becoming a staple and at least
But
voiceover
the
announcing.
proximity
Yeah.
effect on it and the fact that the pattern's so narrow means that if you have to do extended reads of any kind and you move like a centimeter, you're going to change the tonality of your voice. And like I've been listening to some audiobooks, like very popular audiobooks recently from like very high-end author, high-end publisher, and you can hear the changes over different sections of the audiobook. And as an audio person, it's jarring to me, right? So Scott was looking for something that he'd be able to read longer reads on and not have to worry about that, right? Not have to sit rock solid and yada yada. So we ended up going with the V13, and he has such a powerful, deep voice that we ended up actually taking that 9 pattern switch and we moved it towards Omni, which takes away some of the proximity effect, which for him is a good thing, and also widens out the pattern so the sweet spot's even wider. And as long as you have a decent treated space to do your VO in, it's not really a problem for picking up room sound and stuff like that. So he was able to do his reads and not have to worry about that. He said, could you make this sound like my 416 through my Avalon? So we're tweaking settings, and then his agent calls and he's like, hey, you've got this movie trailer in 2 minutes. And I'm like frantically starting to put things back together. He goes, no, let's just see if they notice. And then like 2 months later, I heard him reading the Valerian and something movie title. And I heard him like 2 months later on TV, and I was like, that's so cool. That's my mic. That was a very surreal experience.
Part of my responsibility in working with Scott and all the other voice actors is to make sure that whatever microphone they want to use is going to sound good in their space. And with Scott's room, we had a very kind of minimalistic treatment. It's a minimal treatment where the ceiling is a totally 100% dead bass trap.
Mhm.
And then we only use a couple of panels where necessary to get rid of some reflection in the room. So we allow the room to be more involved. Also, Scott is a massive collector and he's got a million trinkets and objects in the room. So that actually works as a diffuser. So the sound basically scatters
Yeah.
and bounces in a million random directions. But over the time, I've been tuning his setup as well. And now we really do have like a distinctly different sound for the V13 that's unique from the 416,
Mhm.
but they're not like totally different worlds.
Yeah.
Like it's like they're cousins in a
Yeah.
way.
And I mean, like the ultimate goal, if you're going to have multiple microphones as a VO guy, I assume it's because you're doing, a trailer is requiring that 416 sound, right? A movie trailer or whatever. Whereas a long narration on like a documentary or an audiobook or instructional video, voiceover or whatever, that's an entirely different sound. You don't want it to be in your face and overloading the subwoofers in the theater like a movie trailer read does, right? You want it to be a little softer. So ultimately, I kind of think about microphones the way I'm not sure if you or your viewers ever have watched Bob Ross, right? But like, he had like 6 or 7 brushes and they all did different things. He didn't paint the happy little trees with the 2-inch brush and he didn't sign his name with the fan brush and things like that, right? Like they all have different purposes to do different things. They're still ultimately involved in the act of painting. But that means that when I design, I need to think of that way. And when people purchase mics, they need to think about it that way. As much as I'd like to say, just go out and buy a V4 because it's going to make you sound better or whatever. That's not necessarily the case, depending on what you're doing and depending on your vocal timbre and stuff. There is no one mic that is the quote best mic.
Yeah.
So
the V4 I've known since, it's prior generation. So now it's in a Gen 2. What was the motivation to move from the original design and go to a Gen 2 microphone of the V4?
Yeah, actually, it started. I took a negative and turned it into a positive because what had happened is, there was COVID during 2020 and supply chains became super unreliable for everybody, right? So I had to, in the middle of a supply chain crisis, rejigger my supply chain. When we first started, what I was doing is I was taking existing metalwork that was built in factories in China and then I'd get their drawings and then I'd modify it. We'd create our own circuit. We tuned our own capsule. That came from a different place. The shock mounts came from a different place. We pull it all together, assemble it in California, right? So that's still what we're doing. However, because the supplier became so unreliable, I'm like, I'm just going to design my own metalwork. All of them are going to be the same body size, which is an economies of scale thing. And it's significantly larger, which means I can fit more cool stuff in it as an electrical engineer, especially in a cylinder like that. You really have to think 3-dimensionally when you're designing PCB. I'm designing one right now for a small diaphragm condenser, which is even skinnier and even more restrictive on component choice. So I was able to fit bigger, nicer resistors, bigger, nicer capacitors. We were able to lower the noise floor by another couple decibels, and it was already a quiet mic, and now it's just like dead silent, which is awesome.
That's really important for voiceover. That's a big important spec we listen for. I listen for is how much noise am I hearing, because so much voiceover is recorded in a vacuum, especially narration, where it's literally only a voice. So that noise spec is pretty important to us. So that's great to hear that.
Yeah, so we reduced the noise floor by a lot. We're using US made resistors in there, which reduce the noise floor. We've always cryogenically treated our components, which reduces the noise floor. So, but yeah, it was taking a negative thing, which was my supply chain was falling apart because of a global pandemic, and turning into a positive, which was, hey, we can standardize our sizes. I can get more cool stuff in here and redesign all of it, own all of the metalwork as a company, as opposed to just piggybacking on existing metalwork, which was the only way we could get started. Because of tooling costs, you're talking 20, 30, 40 grand just to get everything tooled up. And we're like, we don't have that kind of money, So to start up, we're like, let's just use that. The stuff that's machined, I can modify for our purposes, adding switch holes and tube vents and things like that. And then the capsule's obviously the most important part of the mic. So that was a really important thing that we spent a long time tuning as well.
So the one thing that was interesting, not only the physical size of the mic changed, but the physical controls of the mic changed.
Yes.
And you decided an interesting choice was to consolidate the controls into one single switch, right?
On the first one, there was a roll off and a pad.
Right.
And that circuit, while being useful to be able to put the roll off and the pad on a single pull switch, the problem was that circuit, because it was technically an active circuit, inherently added some noise to the signal.
Right.
And I didn't like that. And also that means that there were parts in there that are technically more unreliable than a truly passive part. So
Right.
when we went to the Gen 2, I said, well, I'm just going to add a two-way pad and eliminate the roll-off, which I know you weren't a huge fan of. And it's something that we've considered adding back. We'd have to figure out a way to get a third switch in there is the problem.
Well, I'm not so worried about that anymore because, the problem is most audio interfaces that are going to be used by the typical voice actor don't have a roll-off. They don't have an internal roll-off. Almost none of them do. Until the Passport came out.
Yeah.
My own audio interface, which has a high-pass filter at 80 hertz on a 12 dB slope. And this is where the high-pass filter probably should be, is here in here in your interface. Nobody's doing that. So I don't even care that much about microphones not having it. And I do know for a fact that some microphones that I've loved over the years, that there was an audible increase in self-noise when you engaged the high-pass filter, some egregiously so, where I had to tell people, turn that off, turn that off.
It can be a little more complex, like our V4, our first design. And that ended up causing a noise floor issue that I wasn't a huge fan of. Whereas the pad's just capacitive pad is really simple. It's one component changing in and out. That's not going to add any noise.
Now, the cool thing about the pad for people that don't know is you're thinking, well, I have a gain knob on my interface. Why don't I just turn that? But the cool thing about the pad is you can really, for most voice actors, you really only need two settings for the most part. You need a level for a conversational, normal, as Mark Cashman calls it, the well-known voice coach, 100% voice. This is the way I sound when I talk.
Yeah.
But then you also need a setting for acting on characters, for games, and animation, where your voice is super dynamic and very intense at times. So to be able to literally just flick a switch and now be in game mode or character mode and have a repeatable setting that's exactly the same every single time for consistency, that's really useful. So having that pad switch is probably the most useful thing now on a microphone.
I will say this, electronically, that pad is sometimes, it's not about that you're overloading your preamp, although that can be the case, but you're going to introduce distortion within the microphone electronics. So where we put the pad, it's way up high in the circuit, right off the capsule, right? And what that does is that lets it more gently hit these components that might otherwise start distorting with a loud signal. So you might have a pad on the interface, but if it's overloading the mic electronics, not the interface electronics, it doesn't matter. It's dependent on the mic. That mic can take an absurd amount of SPL. We've put that mic inside a kick drum, so we know it can take an absurd amount of SPL. So
what's the SPL on a kick drum? 140 plus? I mean, where's it get?
And with the 20 dB pad, we can get up to I think it's 153, which is like SM57 levels of SPL handling. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Speaking of the SM57 and the SM series of microphones dynamics, is that something that you guys want to be stepping into in terms of getting a microphone that's more, well, let's say what we're doing right now, interview, podcast, broadcast kind of?
I've thought about it, but here's the problem. With dynamics, there's a lot of people doing them really well already. And if I'm going to do something, it has to be new. I'm not just going to make an SM7 clone, right?
It doesn't have to be dynamic.
Yes, and that's the thing. I'm looking at doing a condenser voiceover specific mic. It's just going to take a little bit of time to tool it out and get it going. But it'll be like a medium diaphragm capsule. It'll have the pad and the roll off. It'll be front address. It'll have built-in shock mount and pop filtering, which I think is really important. Being able to just magnetically clip a pop filter on there and have it not be in the way like a lot of pop filters. Some of those big pop filters, they get in the way of your copy, or if you're doing stuff on video, it can be a problem, right? So having an effective but minimalist pop filter is going to be really important on that. And I'm just going to make it magnetic. So yeah, it's something I'm working on, but we're not there yet. I've got about 1 million ideas and only 24 hours in a day.
You got the same problem, man. I have my task list now in Google, and it's just like overwhelming. And I scroll down pretty far sometimes, and I'm like, Oh, actually, that's pretty important. I
Yeah.
should have been working on that for the last 3 months, and I forgot about it.
I
Yeah.
do it. I refresh it every single day in my planner and put the tasks in. And that helps me remember them. And it also helps me prioritize for the day. I started doing that 2.5 years ago. I read Atomic Habits and Power of Habit and just started doing a daily planner thing. And it really changed my life for the better.
I love that because I saw you at the show. The first thing you did was whip out a notebook and you were scribbling down notes. You were putting down things I was talking about. And I was like, this is so old school, analog, paper, pen, notebook. But then I thought, we're in this. I mean, you remember that was a rough show on your location at the NAMM
Yeah.
show in front of the other booth that was like playing a band live. That was brutal.
Mm-hmm.
So for you to be able to just like note down things was awesome. And then I actually completely tangentially here, I was at a bookstore with my partner, my girlfriend, and they had planners at 70% off. I love a sale. And of course, they're on sale right now because it's February.
Yeah.
So I grabbed one and I was like, now we're going to have a physical thing that we both write in. And so we can literally be on the same page
Yeah.
because it was a constant, what are you doing? I'm like, well, I sent you my schedule. Didn't you see
Mhm.
it? Well, it's crazy. I can't understand your schedule. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I get it. So that's so cool that I love that you do that. And that's
Honestly, the
working for
analog
you.
thing, I tried every to-do list app. I tried just notes on my phone. There's something about it that, maybe it's the fact that I grew up kind of in between where computers were starting to come into the
Yep.
forefront. And so I still learned cursive in school and stuff. And now why would they teach that to kids? That's freaking useless, right? They're not teaching cursive anymore because why? So when I tried all that stuff and then I ended up going to the paper planner, I'm like, this just works for me. It's not to say it's the solution for everybody, but my wife and I do the same thing. We have a paper planner that's like our together planner. And I also, for events way in the future, I still put it on my calendar app. That also gives me an electronic reminder so I can pull my head out of whatever I'm doing and, come do this
Yeah.
show. But there's something about paper and also something about physically crossing something off a list that gets the dopamine reward going in your brain, I think, as well. That's just a theory, but I think for me it works. I spent a
Yep.
lot of time trying to optimize that system, and I'm still optimizing it, to be honest with
It's great. I mean, the last time I would take a lot of notes was when they looked like this.
you. I love it.
You
I'm
know what that
seeing a
is?
bunch of waveform stuff.
That is a physics, if I recall correctly, my mom found this. This is a physics, I think, final exam cheat sheet for
That you were
physics
allowed to
in
have
college.
one 3x5 card or whatever, so you crammed it in.
I'm assuming I remember that I was allowed to have a
But
3
it's
by
possible
5
you
card.
weren't.
It's very possible we were not
Yep.
supposed to have this, but yeah, that's a semester's worth of physics on a note card right
Wow.
there. But there is something to be said for that. I lost that skill of writing. I was an engineer. I had to write neatly. I had to write in a certain style. It had to be super legible. And I lost that. It's atrophied and it sucks. And I want to bring that back. So I think that's cool that you did that. It reminds me that I should be practicing that more. So this is why I love these conversations. We go way off topic, but it's fun because this is
Yeah.
what people want to know.
Yeah. It's a nice thing to do, but like I said, it's not for me. It was super helpful as somebody who has a lot to do and is bad at remembering important things and important dates and stuff like that. And it's just like, okay, for my own self, I have to be organized. And that on its own has made me better at remembering stuff. Just the act of writing it down and prioritizing it at the beginning of my day. After breakfast, after walking the dogs, I sit down with my second cup of coffee and I plan my day out. And that makes my days, if I do it well and I'm consistent with it, it's so much more efficient, so much smoother, so much less stressful.
Consistency is the key, and that's super difficult for me as someone that's realized at 51 years old, I have adult ADHD, and I have to figure out tools to fix my brain or work around that, so that I can
Your
stay
brain's
on
still
task.
plastic though, no matter whether you have ADHD or autism or whatever, right? Like our brains are
Yeah,
plastic and it's one of the few organs that neurogenesis keeps happening as we get older, right? Like our other organs slow down, our brain does not. And keeping it plastic has to do with learning. I mean, I would recommend highly the three books I read that really changed things for me were Power of Habit, and there's like an actual Power of Habit planner I used for the first time, and that helped me like experiment with different ways of scheduling. And then Atomic Habits, which I'm sure you've heard of, that one became very popular. And then the other one I read was Buddha's Brain, and it's basically this merging of neuroscience and Buddhist principles that I found really, really interesting, because
Awesome.
I'm an empirical person, and it helped explain the why of things in your brain, including attention, including, our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and how that affects our daily lives, and how that affects our equanimity and stuff like that. So that, as an empiricist, was super helpful for me to understand what was going on in my head chemically when all these things were happening, and that allowed me
Wow.
to um, push through new habits. So
Well,
yeah.
whether you knew it or not, you just influenced me to read some new things and try some new practices.
Well, man, if
And
you're
I
not moving
appreciate that.
forward, you're moving backwards, man. That's how water works. You're either moving or
Hmm.
you're stagnating, right? So
Hmm.
I'm always, I never want to fossilize and stand still, in terms of growth, you know.
Absolutely. Well, you guys need to stay tuned with what Vanguard's doing and how would they best do that?
Yeah, I think probably the number one way is social media. Facebook, Vanguard Audio Labs; Instagram, Vanguard Audio Labs. I have really stupid, niche audio memes, if you like that, if you want to have a ridiculous groaning laugh at some of my awful puns and goofy memes and
Yes.
stuff like that. Then
Yes.
I also do
Yes.
mic repair on the side. So, like, I explains how certain parts of microphone works. And if you're into the physical and the physics and the electronics part of it, I try and dumb it down because I'm a self-taught engineer. So fortunately, all those big words for the professors drill into you never really penetrate in the same way. So I try and dumb it down and explain it in like a minute and a half, which is the limit of reels on Instagram anyway. So it forces me to compress it. And we've got a sale going on the V4s right now. Actually, we've got B stock V4s and the black Eclipse V4s are 20% off with a free laser engraving right now.
Do they go directly to
They can
vanguardaudiolabs.com
do
for
it
that?
directly, or they can do it through one of their favorite dealers. If you love your Vintage King or Vintage King guy, then go through your Vintage King guy. You can also just go to shop.vanguardaudiolabs.com, and it's right on the front page. It's the first slider. So yeah, you can save
Fantastic.
20% right now just because I've got a few too many of the B stock ones. And I don't like when mics are sitting on the shelf. I feel like they should be doing their job as a tool and making music. So I'm like, let's get these off to someone who's going to do cool stuff with them.
Nice. Well, I will make sure I get this video up timely so people can see that promotion. And this video will be evergreen, but that's how it goes. You snooze, you lose, folks. Anyway, thanks. Thanks, Derek, man. It's been really fun hanging out with you. We'll do it again another time where we can really look at your mic lineup and get a little bit more geeky. But this is the kind of conversation I love, and I really appreciate your time a lot. Thank you, Derek.
Oh, thanks for having me, man. I'm looking forward to joining you on Pro Audio Suite and just having a good old fashioned hangout. We don't even have to talk about mics at all if you don't want.
It'll happen. Trust us. I hate to say this. I'm going to say it anyway. We're a non-boring Pensado's place.
There's nothing wrong with saying that out loud. Pensado's place was very niche, and you had to really like that subject matter. It was for the
Yeah.
hardcores,
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
And I
But yeah,
apologize
no.
to anybody who heard my foster dog and my resident dog wrestling in the background. That's poor voiceover technique to not be in an insulated room. But
Well, through the power of magic machine learning AI audio processing, they're not going to hear any of that.
oh goodness,
Don't
because
worry.
they were going at it for a good 10 minutes there.
All right, man. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. We'll see you again, Derek. Take care.
So yeah, take care.